So we have discussed consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now what I want you to think about is to see what happens when there is some interference in the market. Sometimes the government in its wisdom decides that the price is too high, that the equilibrium price is too high. So suppose the government imposes a price ceiling. Let's see what happens. So just as usual, we will draw the demand and supply curves, quantity, price, demand and supply. And of course, just like before, the equilibrium price will be P0 and the equilibrium quantity Q0. And if you remember, we said that the consumer surplus will be this area and the seller surplus will be shaded red. Now suppose the government decides that P0 is too high a price and the price really should be lower. So an example could be rent control. So the government believes that the prices that landlords are charging to their tenants is too high and it would be useful to lower the price so that more people can find rent affordable. So let's suppose the price is now P1. At a price of P1, what happens? Well, the quantity demanded is now QD, whereas the quantity supplied is QS. And now, of course, there is a shortage because the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Of course, you can't force landlords to offer up their apartments for rent, so the amount that will be transacted, that is bought and sold, will of course be QS. So let's see what happens to the consumer surplus and the producer surplus at this particular quantity and at this price P1. So I will extend this line upwards till it reaches here. So now what has happened to the consumer surplus? Well, earlier the consumer surplus was this whole blue shaded area. Now some of that consumer surplus actually has increased, and because some people are able to buy or able to rent properties at a lower price, so I shall make this part also shaded blue. So this is an increase or addition to the consumer surplus. Well, what happened to the producer surplus? Earlier it was this big triangle. Now some of that has been lost to the consumers because now we are forcing landlords to rent out their apartments at a lower price. But something else has also happened. This small triangle and this other small triangle, so this part which is shaded blue and this part which is shaded red, has now vanished. What has happened? Now the quantity supplied or the quantity bought and sold is lower than the equilibrium quantity. So consequently, there are people out here who would have been willing to rent apartments at this price, and then there are sellers out here who would have been willing to supply or provide apartments for rent at this price. Now those transactions are not taking place. Consequently, this particular area which I will shade black is an area which has been lost. So in other words, what has happened is now because of the interference in the market by the government, there has been a loss in the welfare. You can think about it somewhat differently. The government has introduced rent control. Has it benefited anyone? Certainly. There are now people who are renting apartments at a price which is at lower than the equilibrium price. So those who found properties to rent at the lower price have certainly benefited. Has anybody lost out? Well, certainly There are people who would earlier be able to rent their apartments at a higher price, at a higher rent. Now they are having to make do with a lower rent. So certainly they have lost out. Anybody else? Well, earlier there were people who were willing to rent properties at a price which is above the equilibrium price, and there are people who would be willing to give their apartments out on rent at a price below the equilibrium price. But now those transactions are not taking place. So there are a number of people who would want to rent and the number of people who want to rent out their properties, but they don't meet each other. No transactions take place. So and that is of course a loss to the society.